Good morning, everybody. My name is Darren Anstee, and I'm a solutions architect for Arbor Networks in the EMEA region. And for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about Arbor's 2011 Infrastructure Security Report. This is the 7th year that Arbor has built the Infrastructure Security Report based on the collated results of our Infrastructure Security Survey. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Infrastructure Security Survey, it's something that we do annually to gather together the experiences and observations of the broader operational security community for the year just gone, 2011 in this case, and also their concerns for the upcoming year, this year. As in previous iterations of the survey, we tried to improve the questions and the clarity of what we were asking. We've also tried to improve the way in which we analyse the data to give as broad and as deep a view as possible into what's going on within the internet threat landscape and more broadly within operational security. So I do have quite a bit to get through in the next 30 minutes. So I'd just like to start off talking a little bit about the survey itself and the people that responded to the survey. The survey was sent out in October last year, and we collected results right the way through until the end of November. The survey comprised of 132 different questions, a mixture of both free-form and also multiple choice questions, and this year we had 114 different responses. What we're trying to get when we send the survey out is a broad spread of different kinds of respondents in terms of the types of network operators that respond to the survey. And this year, as you can see here, we did get a pretty broad response, a mixture of both Tier 1s, Tier 2s, Tier 3s, mobile service providers, educational establishments, and that's really what we're aiming for, because that gives us a broad view of what's actually going on out there. And actually the spread that we had this year was actually very similar to the spread that we had last year, which makes comparing and contrasting the two sets of data easier for us. In terms of the geographic distribution of survey respondents, again we got a very broad spread, which again is exactly what we're looking for. Again it was very similar to what we had last year, which makes the analysis easier. Two other things that are worth pointing out about the survey respondents. Firstly, we don't just send the survey out to Arbor customers. It's a much broader distribution list than that, because we are trying to get as broad a view as possible as to what people are seeing out there and what they're using to deal with security threats. Secondly, everyone that responds to the survey is directly involved in operational security. And this year, 77% of our survey respondents were either security or networking engineers. And that means they're dealing with security incidents on a day-to-day basis. The other 23% were management, but still within operational security. So everyone that responds to the survey is directly involved in operational security and has an insight into what's going on there. What I'm going to do now is talk to some of the key findings of the survey at a pretty high level, and then I'm going to drill down into some of these through some of the subsequent slides. So I'll be going fairly quickly through these, but I will drill down so you can see the base data, understand where we've got these conclusions from. So firstly, any network operator can be a target for a DDoS attack. And this really talks to the fact that we've all seen a change in DDoS attack motivations over the past couple of years. Historically, we used to see a lot of attacks based around reputation in the hacker community, or based around financial gain for the people doing the attacking in terms of either extortion or down to online gaming and things like that. And in a lot of cases, we simply didn't know what was behind attacks. But we've all seen the growth of ideological hacktivism and internet vandalism from groups such as Anonymous and LulzSec. And this year we asked our survey respondents what they perceived to be behind the attacks they were seeing on their networks and targeting their customers. And ideological hacktivism and internet vandalism came out as numbers 1 and 2. And that change in motivations behind the attacks that we're seeing out there has really broadened the spread of who is being targeted. And it's going to change the way that we have to look at how we risk analyze DDoS when we're looking at business continuity and things like that. Secondly, size and scope of attacks continues to grow. More of our survey respondents are seeing larger attacks over 10 gigabits per second, attacks over 1 gigabits per second. We're also seeing, our respondents are seeing more application layer attacks targeting web services. And application layer attacks are the most concerning types of DDoS attacks, because they can be very effective at very low traffic rates and with very small numbers of hosts involved, and that can make them very difficult to proactively detect and mitigate. Also, quite a high proportion of our survey respondents are now seeing multi-vector attacks, and multi-vector attacks is when the attackers combine together different attack vectors because they know that by doing that they stand a higher chance of achieving their goals. So overall, attack sophistication and frequency does seem to be going up at the moment, and did seem to be going up from our respondents' perspective through 2011. Thirdly, the first ever report in our survey of a DDoS attack against an IPv6 service. Now, anecdotally, we actually know that these have been going on for quite a number of years now, mainly against 6-4 gateways. But this is the first time that we've actually seen one within the survey responses. And we think this is likely to be a little bit of a watershed in that there weren't very many of them this year. Not many of our survey respondents indicated that they'd seen attacks against V6 services. But we think in subsequent years we are likely to see more and more of these larger attacks, more complex attacks targeting V6. At the moment, there really aren't very many of them. Mainly because we think there isn't sufficient value there within the V6 services. Attackers are looking to attack things either for reputation, for financial gain, or on some kind of ideological grounds. At the moment, we don't think the attackers see the value in hitting V6 services. There aren't that many subscribers yet, there aren't that many dedicated V6 services yet. But as I mentioned, we do think this is just the start of the attacks that we're going to be seeing out there. Next, there's continued uncertainty around the visibility and threat detection capabilities within mobile operators. Last year was the first year for the survey covering 2010, where we had a section dedicated to mobile network operators. And one of the key findings that we had last year was that mobile network operators had very limited visibility of the traffic on both their mobile packet core and also on the internet side, the GI side of their infrastructure. This year we asked a similar set of questions, and we were actually slightly surprised to find out that the answer had turned round almost 180 degrees. This year what we found was that most mobile operators stated that they had excellent visibility of the traffic on both their mobile packet cores and on the internet side of their networks. And we were expecting there to be a substantial improvement there, but not as large an improvement as we actually got. I mean, Arbor has been working with quite a lot of mobile operators over the past year, so that's one reason why we thought there was going to be an improvement, and we know that other vendors have as well. But the scale of the improvement was larger than we were expecting. Some of the subsequent questions in that section of the survey, though, did still seem to indicate that a significant minority of mobile operators still had some limitations in terms of the threat detection capabilities they had on their networks, and also in terms of being able to identify how many of their subscribers were malware infected and things like that. So over the past year, visibility and threat detection capabilities within mobile service providers do seem to have increased quite substantially, but there is still a little way to go there. Next, stateful firewalls, IPSs and load balancers. We're continuing to see problems with them during DDoS attacks. One of the key findings that we had in last year's survey again was that just over a half of our survey respondents who had, who offered data center services and who had firewalls and IPSs deployed in front of those services saw those firewalls and IPSs fail during 2010 due to DDoS attacks. This year we asked a similar set of questions, and unfortunately we got a largely similar set of answers. It was slightly better, but not hugely. So we are continuing to see problems where devices that maintain a lot of per connection state are going over during DDoS attacks, and of course when they fall over, everything behind them effectively becomes unreachable. So we do need to be protecting these devices from state exhaustion attacks using things like infrastructure ACLs and also intelligent DDoS mitigation systems. Then last but not least, trust issues across international boundaries. And there are two findings there, one of which you'll all be expecting, and one of which kind of contradicts some of the mainstream press articles that continue to circulate out there. And I'll come on to those in a minute, just talk about it once, because I'm going to be a little bit short of time, I think. So, threats and concerns. What are the operational threats and concerns that people saw for 2011 and also for this year? Well, one thing that came through pretty clearly from the survey was that DDoS is top of mind for a lot of our survey respondents. In terms of operational security threats for 2011, DDoS attacks against customers came in as number 1. And in fact, 4 of the top 6 were DDoS related, with botnets and misconfiguration also thrown into the mix. In terms of concerns for this year, DDoS took the top 4 spots, with attacks against customers at number 1 and attacks against ancillary service infrastructure at number 2. And in fact, Anecdotally, Arbor is seeing a lot of network operators become far more focused on protecting their ancillary service infrastructure, their DNS servers, SMTP gateways, the web portals that they give their customers to log in, see their services, buy additional services, things like that. We are seeing a lot more focus from network operators on putting traffic visibility, threat detection and mitigation solutions in front of those systems. In terms of end-user DDoS threat awareness, 56% of our survey respondents indicated that they thought their end users were more aware of the DDoS threat in 2011 than they had been in previous years. And that's obviously great, because if people are aware of a threat, they'll prepare for it, they'll put solutions in place to mitigate the impact of a DDoS attack. What's slightly less positive, though, is the reasons behind that awareness. Number one was actually being hit with a DDoS attack, with numbers 2 and 3 being the mainstream press and risk analysis. And obviously you want people to learn about the threat by hearing about it, by reading about it, by user groups, things like that, not by actually being targeted, because that's far more costly. In terms of trust issues across international boundaries, the one that kind of contradicts some of the articles that continue to do the rounds in the press is that people do not seem to be concerned about the geographic origins of the equipment they're deploying in their networks. People are not worried about backdoors and things like that. 67% of our survey respondents indicated they are not worried about where their equipment comes from. However, 75% do perceive traffic from specific geographic locations to be more likely to be a threat to their customers and our services, and we all know which geographic locations I'm talking about there. In terms of DDoS attack changes and how DDoS attacks have changed through 2011, what kind of change in vectors we've seen, first thing really is this change in motivations. We have seen this change in motivations over the past couple of years. This was the first year we actually asked our survey respondents what they felt was behind a lot of the attacks they were seeing on their networks. And ideological hacktivism and internet vandalism came out as numbers 1 and 2. We were actually expecting to get unknown as the top one there. And this change in motivations has broadened the spread of who is being targeted. Now you can be targeted because one of your employees says something on a social media site that others disagree with. You can be targeted for buying services from a business or selling services to a business, or for just being affiliated with a government or a specific government policy. So it really is going to change the way in which we have to look at DDoS in terms of business continuity, the way it gets risk analyzed and things like that, the way we have to prepare for actually being attacked. In terms of the attacks that we saw through 2011 from the survey, one thing came over pretty clearly, and that's that large attacks are now increasingly commonplace. 13% of our respondents saw attacks over 10 gigabits per second, 40% saw attacks over 1 gigabits per second. In terms of peak reported attack sizes, the largest attack reported in the survey was 60 gigs a second in 2011. And that's actually lower than in 2010, and that was actually a bit of a surprise for us, because historically we're used to seeing very strong growth in the year-on-year peak reported attack sizes. Just to give you an example, in 2010, as you can see there, the largest reported attack was just over 100 gigs. And that represented a 1,000% increase over what we'd seen going back to 2005. But this year it was down at 60 gigs. I say down at 60 gigs, but 60 gigabits per second is still a significant traffic volume. It's going to have a fairly major impact on a lot of networks. So when we first saw this, we sat down and had to think about why we thought this might be. And we thought, well, it could be down to the fact that whatever was targeted with that 60 gig attack only needed 60 gig to actually take it offline. And we are seeing attackers being a lot smarter about only applying the resources that they absolutely have to achieve their goals. Or we thought maybe it's down to the increased use of application layer DDoS attacks, which can be effective at much lower traffic rates. But then what we did is we went to look at some Atlas data to see if that corroborated what we were seeing from the infrastructure security survey. And unfortunately it didn't. For those of you who don't know Atlas, Atlas is a system that Arbor maintains to give us a picture of what's going on the internet. It lets us see how much traffic there is, who's connected to who, what types of traffic there are, what the overall shape of the internet looks like, and it lets us see what kind of threats are actually going on out there. One of the key data sources for Atlas is something known as Internet Trends, which relies on around 200 Arbor customers sharing anonymized data with us on an hourly basis. And a part of that anonymized data is DDoS threat information. And what we can see, what we can do with that information is trend over time what's changing, what's going on out there. What this graph here shows is the peak monitored attack sizes that we've been tracking going back to January 2009. And as you can see, there's there is consistent growth there, but as you can also see in 2011 there are a number of spikes at 80, 100, 90 and also again at 100 gigs. So we don't think peak attack sizes really have fallen back from 100 to 60 gigs from 2010 to 2011. What we actually think is that they've plateaued at that 80 to 100 gig level. So we're not seeing the strong growth that we used to see, but attacks of that kind of magnitude are still going to have a pretty major impact on a lot of networks out there. Now on to application layer attacks, and application layer attacks are by far the most concerning kinds of attacks that we see out there, and they've really come to prevalence over the last 3 to 4 years. They are concerning because they can be so effective at low traffic rates with small numbers of hosts involved, and from a protocol perspective the traffic can look entirely legitimate, and that can make them very difficult to detect proactively and mitigate proactively before they have an impact to a customer service. You can do it, but it is all about having the right people, processes, services and solutions in place. In 2011, a higher percentage of our respondents saw application layer attacks targeting web services and IRC, but conversely, fewer of them saw attacks against DNS, SMTP and HTTPS services. Although we are now seeing more advanced attack vectors being used against HTTPS, we've started to see slow LORIS being used, as well as the usual TCP, UDP and renegotiation attacks. What's most concerning in this area though is here, and that's that 32% of our survey respondents saw multi-vector attacks, and this is where attackers launch a volumetric and an application layer attack at the same time, usually to try and obfuscate the application layer attack vector that they're using, because by doing this they know they stand a greater chance of achieving their goals of taking a site or a service down. Now on to attack frequency, and as in previous surveys, attack frequency does appear to be continuing to increase, with 91% of our survey respondents seeing at least one attack per month and 44% seeing 10 or more attacks per month. So just in this little area of the survey we can see that overall there are more attacks going on out there. We can see that there are more application layer attacks against web services, which anecdotally is what Arbor is hearing from its customers. And we can also see that attackers seem to have stepped up another gear in terms of both the complexity of the individual attack vectors that they're using, and also in terms of the way that they're combining attack vectors together to try and achieve their goals. In terms of DDoS detection, NetFlow appears to be pretty key to most of our survey respondents, with 63% of them using commercial NetFlow processing tools to detect, classify and trace back DDoS attacks, so that they've got the information they then need to mitigate those attacks. 39% are using open source tools to do the same thing. That is more than 100% obviously, but that's because most people tend to use multiple tools to make sure that they get complete coverage. What's interesting around this area though is that just over a half of our survey respondents indicated that getting layer 7 data into NetFlow was important to them. And that shows that a lot of the operational security community are aware of the threat posed by application layer attacks. Because they can be so stealthy, so low and slow as they're sometimes called, it can be very difficult to detect them at layers 3 and 4 using things like traditional NetFlow. You need to see what's going on inside packets, and at the moment the only way to do that is via a span or a tap or an inline device. If we could get that information into NetFlow, then we'd be able to detect more of those attacks using NetFlow, and 55% of our survey respondents indicated that they kind of understood this and were looking for those features and functionality. Now on to data center security, and as in previous iterations of the survey, we had a whole section dedicated to service providers who offered data center services. This year, 63% of our survey respondents said that they offered data center services, and 56% of those had been targeted by DDoS attacks. Last year, one of our key findings was that just over a half of our data center service providers who offered who had firewalls and IPSs deployed in front of their services saw those firewalls and IPSs fail due to DDoS attacks. This year that number has fallen to 42%, which obviously is an improvement, but it's still not that great. And we think it has improved primarily because people are starting to protect these devices with infrastructure ACLs and also with intelligent DDoS mitigation systems. And in fact, in this particular area, data center service providers, there was a 14% increase in the use of intelligent DDoS mitigation systems. This year, we also asked a similar set of questions about load balancers, and 96% of our survey respondents, no surprise there, said that they used load balancers in their infrastructure. But again, 43% of them said that they'd seen those load balancers fail due to DDoS attacks. So we do seem to be seeing a continuing problem where state-heavy devices that maintain per connection state, are falling over during DDoS attacks, and we need to be protecting those devices to ensure that we can maintain our customer service and our businesses effectively. In terms of the targets of DDoS attacks, IDC customers came out as number one here, with 87% of our survey respondents seeing attacks against their customers and 42% seeing attacks against their ancillary service infrastructure. What's interesting here is that this is a pretty big change from previous years. Historically, you'd have seen this and this being pretty much the same at around this level. So last year, far more data center service providers saw attacks directed against their customers. In terms of attack frequencies and impacts, 20% of our data center service providers are seeing more than 50 attacks per month in 2011, and that's actually up 5% on the previous year. But what's most concerning in this area is that 25% of our data center service providers saw attacks that completely saturated their internet capacity during 2011, and that's an increase of 10% over 2010. And obviously, if you are targeted by an attack that saturates your internet connectivity, there isn't much that you can do at your end of the link. You're reliant on your service provider or managed security service provider to deal with that higher magnitude attack for you. When data center service providers are attacked, in terms of the expenses that they incur, the top expense is the operational expense of actually dealing with the attack. But 44% also saw customer churn directly because of DDoS attacks, and 37% also saw direct revenue impact due to DDoS attacks. So DDoS is not just a technical issue that we have to solve, it can have a pretty major impact to our businesses as well. Now on to IPv6. And again, as in previous iterations of the survey, we had a whole section on IPv6. This year, 76% of our survey respondents indicated that they had v6 enabled on their infrastructure, which is a 10% increase over last year. And in fact, another 15% indicated that they would have v6 enabled by the end of this year. So by the end of this year, 89% of our survey respondents plan to have v6 enabled on their networks. And that's obviously a big number compared to the number of services out there that offer v6. And we think partially that's down to the fact that just over half of our survey respondents indicated that they currently only use v6 for network management. One thing that was key within the survey in terms of really clear from the responses is that most of our survey respondents indicated that getting better visibility of v6 traffic on their networks was critically important to them. 70% said that. But unfortunately, only 36% had infrastructure that would give them complete visibility of v6 infrastructure using technologies such as NetFlow, with another 27% stating that they had partial support. And obviously, as v6 traffic volumes grow, getting visibility of traffic is going to become more and more important. And that really did divide opinion, how fast v6 is actually going to grow. 42% of our survey respondents indicated that they only expected v6 volumes to grow at 20% this year, whereas 18% said that they expected it to grow by more than 100%. I'm personally in the latter camp there. I think it will grow more than 100% this year, mainly because we're starting from such a low number. Last year during World v6 Day, it grew by 100%, but we're talking about a fraction of 1% to a slightly larger fraction of 1%. So I do think it will continue to grow, but proportionally, we're still talking about small numbers. In terms of v6 use cases, only 9% of our survey respondents actually provide v6 addresses to their subscribers. But on a business side of things, 57% provide v6 addresses to their business customers. So there is a bit of a big split there between the number of people who provide v6 access to end users over and above their business customers. In terms of v6 security concerns, visibility's in there again at number 2, with 60% of our survey respondents indicating that they have little or no visibility of the v6 traffic on their networks. At number 1, though, we have feature parity, and there does seem to be an ongoing concern amongst the survey respondents about getting the tools and features they're used to using to manipulate and control v4 traffic, getting those same tools and features for v6 traffic. At number 3, we have misconfiguration. Not a huge surprise there again, given the lack of operational experience out there with v6. And maybe, I don't know, we didn't ask this question, but maybe that's why more operators have it enabled for network management. Maybe that's to do with getting more experience of using v6 as a technology. And in number 4, we have DDoS. And DDoS, as I mentioned earlier on, this is the first year we've seen DDoS being reported in the Infrastructure Security Survey targeting V6 services. Not very many respondents yet, only 4%, but as I mentioned earlier on, we do think this is the start of something. We do think that from this point we're likely to see more attacks, we're likely to see more complex attacks, and also larger attacks as the number of V6 subscribers increases, and also as the number of V6 services out there increases. Now onto operational security practices. As in previous years, one of the key things that we found from this year's survey was that the majority of our respondents still have less than 10 dedicated operational security personnel, and actually lack of resources was highlighted as the biggest operational security challenge within the survey respondents. One thing that has improved a little bit is that last year, when we asked our survey respondents how many of them rehearsed their DDoS defense drills and operational security processes, 72% of them said that they never did that. This year, that's down to 58%, which is obviously a big improvement, but it's still not that great. And I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to actually rehearse our DDoS defense drills and other operational security processes. You need to know that those contact lists are correct. You need to know that everything is going to work as you would expect. You don't want to be finding out during a pressure situation that something has changed and something is not going to work in the way that you were actually expecting. In terms of staying up to speed on security issues, email lists came out as number one. But what we also found was that people were reliant on vendor groups, certs, C-certs, and also various blogs to gather information about what was actually going on out there. Interestingly, only 41% of our survey respondents actually participated in closed security groups, but 87% indicated that they thought they were very effective. So why the big difference? Well, again, it came back to lack of resources. People didn't feel that they had enough time, enough people to actually participate in those groups. So that's pretty much all I want to say. I think I'm just about out of time. The key takeaways from this, I suppose, on the DDoS side of things were that we are seeing more large attacks going on out there. We are seeing more of these application layer attacks that are using more advanced attack vectors, more complex attack vectors. And the key thing really is that the change in motivations that we've seen out there behind attacks is going to change the way that we have to think about DDoS. A broader spread of businesses are now likely to be targeted, and we need to be thinking about how DDoS can actually impact our business continuity. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.